say it in our show a lot, that deaf is not just a state of being, it's an identity. And it is very much who they are. So that there's a level of sensitivity, but also you just embrace the person as they are, which we're very good at in the artistic community. So that should come naturally. From a production management perspective and a production company perspective, there are budgetary considerations. If you're a hearing company wanting to include deaf actors and deaf artists, you're going to need interpreters. And you need to not look at that as a extenuating cost. You need to put that in as lighting budget, fees for artists, interpreters, added time to do some script conversations and things like that. That's your budget. It shouldn't be set, lighting, costume, media, and then we'll figure out how that works later, because that's not going to help you. Surtitles are my life, and have been for 3 weeks now. The first process is it sounds silly, but having like a Word document online, copy and pasteable version of your script, and putting that into slides. So the way we run our Surtitles here is a slideshow presentation on Keynote for Mac. You could also do it with PowerPoint. So you start by copying and pasting the entire script line by line into a show file, and that's a lot of time. And that's a very flexible process, because as the actors learn their lines and as the actors figure out where the breaks happen and where pauses happen, you'll have to move things around constantly. But step one is get the script into a line breakdown, and starting with the show file as early as possible will help for sure. So we started building the show file in rehearsals 4 weeks ago. We had to consider whether or not we were going to surtitle the entire show, because some of the lines are signed and some of the lines are spoken. We were only going to surtitle Alphonse's lines until we realized that wouldn't be accessible to a deaf audience listening to Miranda's lines, so we surtitled the whole show. So factor that in, you now have your show file, and then you're putting blocking notes in. And the next step, for our process, we did dynamic titling. So our surtitles actually follow the actors around on stage, which has been widely received as an amazing, amazing thing so many times over. So that factored into the set consideration. What are we projecting them onto? You can have an idea of where these titles are going to land on stage. Lots of communication with our set designer, who was also our Surtitles designer in this case, so that helped. About where you're going to have access to them. Once we brought it into the space, figuring out the difference between words on a screen and words on a stage. And in our case, our set is made of a mesh material, so projecting onto it wasn't necessarily the most visible without paint treatment and the right brightness of the projector and the hardware that goes into that. And then actually physically mapping each line onto somewhere on the stage. So in this show, I have about 24 different places where the surtitles land. Then I can scroll through the whole show and say, okay, this will be above the bed, justified text stage right, justified text stage right. If I go into the nitty-gritty, there's grammatical considerations. Do you want to have periods at the end of every sentence, or do you need them? There's how many lines, like the British standards of titles for captions for TV is 35 characters in a line. Here we decided that 2 lines is about as much as we want to have for people to read. We ended up creating a more matte surface to project onto, so we could have lines go more widthwise across multiple panels. So that made them about 2 lines wide 2 lines high by more characters wide. For me, that came down to a more grammatical breakdown as well. So the pacing of the show, where they take breaths, where they go take their jacket off, things like that. Kind of decided where the lines ended up and where the line breaks happened. Other consideration for us was keeping the integrity of the script. So versus the ease of reading for the audience. So we had a conversation in rehearsals way back when we were talking about maybe editing the text in a very, very minimal way to make it more easy to read on the stage. And both actors were very strong about the fact that the integrity has to remain with Adam's written word. The surtitles you see in our show are Adam's script, word for word. maybe plus or minus an and and a but and a couple multiple things like that as far as keeping to the integrity of the word, of the written word. Just the consideration of whether or not you want to put sound effects in your surtitles as well, because if you're looking at them from a comparable to captioning for TV, so we have some phone rings, we have some applauses and things like that, just in brackets on our surtitles, and figuring out what your standard for that will be. We didn't end up surtitling all of the sound effects because there are some that the deaf audience can experience through the subwoofers, so we decided to leave those out of the captioning and just leave that to the experience. Our consideration was because it was dynamic, as opposed to because it was for a deaf audience. So because the titles actually follow them around on stage, normally in text, if you have like a Times New Roman that has a little line on the top, it helps you read left to right when you're typing things out. But for us, we just used an Arial basic blocky sort of font because it wouldn't necessarily always be linear. And it's really crisp, there's no added things because you can't tell the tiny details on, especially for our projection surface. Probably could tell better on a flat white piece of something if you wanted to project on that. Color of the titles is also a consideration when you're again, huge communication with your set designer and where you're going to place these titles, because the color and the font and the size will all go into that. It's just kind of like lighting design in that way. When it comes to surtitles, there's some moments where we fade out the surtitles, like slowly. I think Trevor had very ambitious ideas of the text literally animating to follow the characters across the stage, which we didn't end up doing because it was so hard to read. You need a dedicated person to surtitles, for sure. Outside opinions help, so open communication about what's better. Consistency throughout the show is your best bet, so if you decide one way, you have to make it that way. And the language challenges question in relation to surtitles is one of my favorites. Because I have the understanding of ASL, because I've been studying it myself for a little while, ASL is very condensed as a language compared to English. There are no ands, there's, like random little words that English puts in to be annoying. It says 3 slides, each 2 lines each worth of text, and assigning for maybe 5 seconds. So again, so figuring out where the line breaks happen, and then making sure that you're not going through things too fast for the hearing audience to keep up with, because he can assign them that efficiently, and the audience can't necessarily read them that efficiently. Sometimes I have to linger on a slide for a little bit longer because I know her line will be shorter afterwards. And then the other one is the fact that ASL sometimes says things backwards to what English does. So keywords in the sentence are not where I'd expect them to be. So I have to keep an eye on myself from a lighting perspective. Having a really steep angle front light creates more shadows on their face. Which is harder because you have to realize that the face communicates the language almost as much as or more than the hands actually do, which someone who doesn't know ASL wouldn't know to start off with. Things like designating dimmers for interpreter lights and interpreter specials. We added, the first thing we did when we got into the space was add more house lights in this space, because just when you're doing general rehearsals, you can't be as dark as it normally would be in an old theater. Things like moody lighting have to be approached differently when signing is still happening on stage, because you have to make the choice that the signs are going to be seen, or that the signs aren't going to be seen and the surtitles are going to pick up the slack. Talking about how the audience is going to access it. Are they all going to watch Chris sign all his lines if they are fluent in ASL, or are they going to choose to watch the surtitles as well? Because a lot of people have said they've missed a couple signs because you're not used to watching someone at that distance. Like if you sign really fast, or if you're bouncing between characters, or if you're watching a show and then thought about what you were going to have for dinner for a second, you can still look up and catch it. So thinking of surtitles that way and providing more than one option, that's where deaf interpreting comes in a huge role as well, because then they have 3 options on stage to look at. I've brought a lot of people to come see the show because it's probably one of the most exciting projects I've ever worked on for me personally. And everybody that's walked out of it has learned something or started a conversation they wouldn't have had before. And they're all hearing and they're all continuing on with the rest of their lives, but they all get to see, whether or not you like the story of the show, they all get to talk about what we're doing here. as far as accessibility goes, for sure. And I think that's half the battle. And the fact that it happened and no one complained about, oh, well, you know, interpreters, if those are expensive, we have to figure that out. It's like, no, they're our team, they're our family. We couldn't live without them. There are more people involved to start, but also more stakes a little bit, because we're telling somebody's story. And that happens a lot in theater, but we're telling a very tight-knit community story that hasn't been spoken to before. At least not recently, and not quite in this forum. So I think that was a big learning step